What if the very ground beneath your feet was haunted by secrets older than your own ancestors? What if every whisper of wind, every flicker of movement in the shadows, was a sign that the dead have not truly left us at all? Forget everything you think you know about vampires. Long before Hollywood gave us Dracula, before the world obsessed over bloodsuckers in capes and castles, there was a deeper, older terror. A terror that gripped the hearts of entire villages across the mountains of Romania. A terror so profound that it could make even the bravest man dig up his own brother's grave at midnight, desperate to defend his family from what he feared most. If you love myths, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell to join us in discovering more scary legends. Tonight, we step beyond the myths and into the living darkness. This is not the story of Dracula. This is the true tale of the Strigoi restless dead, the ancient curse, the original Romanian vampire. But the Strigoi are more than monsters. They are symbols of grief, fear, and the struggle to find meaning in tragedy. Their story is a mirror, reflecting the deepest shadows of the human soul. So lock your doors, light a candle, and follow me into the Carpathians, where the dead do not always sleep, and the line between the living and the lost is as thin as morning mist. Let's journey back to the dawn of this myth, into a world as remote and wild as any in Europe, ancient Romania. Imagine, centuries ago, before the world's maps had filled in, before roads tamed the wilds, the Carpathian Mountains were a land of almost impenetrable mystery. In these mountains, forest and fog ruled, wolves howled in the valleys, stags vanished among mossy oaks, and people lived close to the land, so close that every stone, every stream, every ancient tree felt alive. To the old Dacians, Romania's pre-Christian tribes, the forest wasn't just a place to hunt or gather. It was a living cathedral, sacred and untamed. Every feature of the land, mountain, river, or spring was believed to have its own spirit, its own soul. Bears, wolves, stags, they were kin, not just beasts. This was a world where the dead were never truly gone. The ancestors lingered, their spirits walking the same paths they did in life. The veil between worlds was so thin that it could be torn intentionally or by accident. Imagine a young Dacian hunter, kneeling by the grave of his father at dawn, whispering a prayer, believing his father's soul lingers nearby, protecting him or perhaps waiting to be set free. When Christianity arrived, the forest spirits and ancestral ghosts didn't disappear. They simply changed form. Pagan gods became saints, nature spirits became angels and demons, and the idea that the dead might walk among the living survived, wrapped in new symbols. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, was astounded by the Dacians' beliefs about death. To them, dying was not the end, but a crossing. Every few years, they sent a messenger to Zalmoxis, their immortal god. This messenger, selected by lot, was sent brutally, being impaled with 3 spears. If he died instantly, the gods had accepted the sacrifice. If not, another would be chosen. To us, this is horrific. To them, it was hope, a way to communicate with eternity, to beg the spirits for protection, for a good harvest, for survival. This ancient spiritual Gnathis sense that death is a doorway, and the dead linger will survive the rise of empires, the coming of Christianity, even the age of science. In Romania, even today, people will tell you, the mountains remember. Why did the myth of the Strigoi, the returning dead, take root so fiercely? At first glance, it seems like a simple ghost story, but dig deeper, and you find a powerful tool for survival, a kind of folk psychology that helped people cope with the chaos of life. Life in the old Romanian mountains was hard, unpredictable, often tragic. Disease struck without warning, harvests failed, livestock died, science offered no answers. There were no doctors, no germ theory, no explanations for why a child might fall ill or a family line die out. Into this darkness, the legend of the Strigoi brought light of a sort. When disaster struck, it gave the village a target. Instead of facing a universe of random cruelty, people could believe that something or someone was to blame. That belief gave them a chance to fight back, A bad death was the most dangerous omen. If someone died violently by murder, accident, or suicidia, if they died unbaptized, alone, or outside the rituals of the faith, their soul was believed to be restless, unfinished, unable to move on. These restless souls, lonely, angry, full of unfulfilled desire, called become Strigoi, returning from the grave to take from the living what they missed in life: warmth, blood, love, energy. The Strigoi became the explanation for every unexplained misfortune, every streak of bad luck. Real-life example: in a remote village in the 1800s, a family is struck by illness after illness. Livestock die. A baby is stillborn. Desperate, the villagers dig up the grave of a recently deceased uncle. When they open the coffin, they see blood on his lips. The elders declare him a Strigoi. A ritual is performed: staking, decapitation, burning of the heart. By morning, the sickness passes. The story is passed down 4 generations. The curse has been lifted. Of course, today, we see tragedy as a result of bacteria, viruses, or simple misfortune. But for these villagers, the Strigoi offered a story, one that turned terror into action and chaos into ritual. For some, the terror of the Strigoi began not at death, but at birth. To be born with a collar, thin veil of membrane over the face was a mark of destiny. Villagers believed such children were cursed, fated to rise as Strigoi after death. The midwife's job was fraught with danger. She had to carefully remove the caul and burn it, or else risk condemning the child forever. But even then, suspicion clung like a second skin. And it wasn't just the caul. Being the 7th son, being born out of wedlock, dying unbaptized, or dying alone were reasons to be feared. Imagine growing up under this shadow. Every cough, every misfortune in the village, a lost cow, a failed crop could be blamed on you. A lifetime of side glances, whispered conversations, anxious parents praying you would escape your fate. When death came, the rituals were relentless. Mirrors were covered so the soul couldn't get trapped. Clocks were stopped at the moment of death to freeze time. Candles burned by the body all night. The family took turns watching for any unnatural movement, any sign that the deceased might return. In extreme cases, desperate measures were taken. The body might be buried face down, so if it tried to dig out, it would only bury itself deeper. Stones or coins were placed in the mouth to stop the corpse from gnawing its own shrouder, sure sign of vampirism. Nails might be driven into the skull or a sickle placed around the neck, so that any attempt to rise would result in self-destruction. Real-life example: there are documented cases, even into the 20th century, of Romanian families burying relatives with iron spikes or heavy rocks on their chests. In one case, a woman's family exhumed her years after death and found the body shockingly preserved. They performed the ritual second death to keep her from rising as a Strigoi. These practices weren't about hate. They were acts of desperate love, a way to protect both the dead and the living from an eternal curse. When all the rituals, prayers, and protections failed, the community turned to the most drastic and dramatic response: exhumation. This was not a decision made lightly. To dig up the dead was to confront your deepest fears, to admit that the world's order had failed, and that something unnatural was at work. It was never random. The villagers would bring a pure black or pure white horse to the cemetery, believing that such animals could sense evil. One by one, they would lead the horse over each grave. If it shied away, refused to cross, or became agitated, the people knew they had found the suspected Strigoi's resting place. In the late 1800s, an Austrian administrator recorded how he watched in disbelief the Romanian villagers perform this ritual. He described their fear, their resolve, and the sense of desperate purpose that hung over the graveyard like a storm cloud. The exhumation itself was terrifying. Men would dig in silence, shovels clanging softly as the grave gave up its secrets. Torches cast long shadows as the coffin was hauled out of the earth and placed at the edge of the open grave. Everyone watched as the lid was pried open. Anxieties signs. Was the corpse fresh when it should have rotted? Was there color in the face, blood at the lips, hair or nails that seemed to have grown? Did it look as if it had been feeding? If the answer was yes, the elders gave the order. A wooden stake carved from ash, hawthorn, or wild rose was driven through the heart. Prayers were chanted. Sometimes, the head was cut off and buried at the feet, or a sickle was placed around the neck as a final trap. The heart was burned to ash at a crossroads, and the ashes, mixed with water, were given to the afflicted as a cure. To us, this seems grim, almost grotesque, but for them, it was hope, a final, desperate act of control over a world that so often seemed uncontrollable. The ritual was more than superstition. It was a collective facing of grief and fear, a way for the community to unite against the unknown and heal from the wounds of tragedy. The Strigoi's terror didn't stop at the grave. In Romanian folklore, the living could be Strigoi to Strigoi Vaiu, the living vampire. These were people believed to possess supernatural powers, able to drain the life, fortune, or happiness from those around them without ever touching them. If a cow gave sour milk, if crops withered, if a child wasted away, Simeon was often blamed as a Strigoi Vaiu. But these beliefs were as much about suspicion and scapegoating as they were about the supernatural. In tight-knit, struggling villages, social tensions could flare up. The quiet, the different, the disliked could become targets. All it took was a run of bad luck, a neighbor's accusation, and suddenly someone became a living monster in the eyes of the community. Historical insight. In 18th and 19th century Romania, women, especially widows, midwives, and the socially isolated were often accused. Sometimes these suspicions led to violence, shunning, or lifelong ostracism. The Strigoi Vaiu could be anyone, the seventh son of a seventh son, said to possess a double soul, a child born with a caul, someone who seemed unlucky, who walked alone too often, who spoke to animals or knew too much about herbs. On powerful nights like St. Andrew's Eve or St. George's Day, fear peaked. Garlic was hung in doorways and smeared on windowsills. Sacred signs were drawn on doors. Villagers would lock themselves in, hoping to wait out the night. Vivid folklore. On these nights, it was believed that the souls of the Strigoi Vaiu could leave their bodies, flying as owls, cats, or ghostly flames, meeting in wild, hidden clearings to fight other spirits. The fate of the village's crops and fortunes could depend on who won these spectral battles. The legend of the living vampire wasn't just about the supernatural. It was a way for communities to explain misfortune, enforce conformity, and sometimes turn fear into blame. As centuries passed, the Strigoi legend refused to die. In the 18th and 19th centuries, foreign officials sent to govern the region back in disbelief about the rituals they witnessed. Reports describe exhumed corpses, rituals of staking and burning, and the unshakable conviction of the villagers. Some of these officials were Enlightenment thinkers, men of reason and science. To them, the rituals were proof of backwardness, superstition, even madness. Yet, they could not deny the power of belief, or the reality of grief that drove communities to such extremes. Historical reflection. Reports from Austrian officials fueled fascination and horror in Western Europe, inspiring some of the earliest vampire literature. The Strigoi became the prototype for the modern vampire, feeding the world's obsession with the undead, from Bram Stoker's Dracula to the vampires of movies, books, and games. But the Strigoi legend was more than the sum of its rituals. It warsened ice a way to wrestle with fear, to find meaning in loss, and to create order out of chaos. Today, the echoes of the Strigoi still shape Romanian culture. Modern families might no longer stake the dead, but rituals remain. Candles are lit at graves. Stories are told on stormy nights. Garlic still hangs above old doors. Contemporary example. In rural Romania today, you can still find people who will quietly admit to believing in spirits. Tourists flock to Dracula's castle, drawn by the myth, but for many locals, the real stories are older, darker, and rooted in the land itself. And perhaps, even for those who claim not to believe, the Strigoi lingers in every superstition, in every story told in the dark. What, in the end, does the Strigoi legend mean for us today? On the surface, It's a story of monsters, curses, and the restless dead. But at its heart, the Strigoi is about being human. It's about the struggle to make sense of loss, to explain suffering, to fight the helplessness that comes when life seems unfair. It's about the power of community's need to unite in the face of fear, to create rituals that bind us together, to turn our grief into action and our terror into hope. It's also a warning. The story of the Strigoi shows how fear can be turned against the vulnerable, how communities, in their quest for safety, sometimes blame and exile those who are different. The living Strigoi was often the scapegoat, a way for society to avoid confronting the real roots of misfortune. And yet, there is comfort here too. The rituals, the stories, the very act of telling this legend, these are ways to keep darkness at bay. They remind us that we are not alone in our fears, and that even the deepest shadow can be dispelled by morning light. If this story has chilled your bones or sparked your imagination, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your own legends in the comments below. The Strigoi may belong to Romanian folklore, but the fears, hopes, and questions it raises are universal. In every culture, in every heart, the line between the living and the lost is never fully closed. So keep your lantern lit, treasure your stories, and when the wind howls across the night, remember, the Strigoi are watching, and so are we. Until next time, sleep well and watch the shadows.